Ah, okay, here we go. Where did they all go? Where is the light? Where is the light? Okay. Blindly fumbling. Okay, what are we doing here? Right, that's what we're doing. Here we go. Where did they all go? Where is the light? Where is the light? And we is good. So hello, good evening. Before I say hello to those who are lining up on the side to share greetings, let me just explain that yes, I know there is a certain twilight quality to the picture tonight. And no, I don't mean in the sparkly vampire sense. The reason is that the lamp that normally sits right up here has done something bizarre. Anyway, it's dead. So this happened too late for me to replace it with anything. So I am going to be, as I said, slightly twilight tonight. A certain sense of fin d'empire, you know, that whole kind of thing. Anyway, so don't worry about it too much. I was worrying about it myself, and then I suddenly said, "Hang on, you know, like Ted, you're writing, you're reading something you've written. You're not painting. You don't have to worry about getting all of the visual details. In fact, there may be people out there who go, "Thank God, I don't have to see quite so much of him," and that's okay. I feel the same way, which is why I avoid shaving as much as I can. Anyway, so here we are. We are here. Everything else is going to go normally. It's just going to be a little dark and gloomy in the background, and I am going to be a bit chiaroscuro in some positions. So, Emily's here. Hello, Emily. Hello, Kenneth. Jerry, what up? Good to see you. Nancy, hi, Nancy. Jared, good evening. Becca, yes, it is reading time and lovely to see you. Barb, Ann, hi, Barb. And John, oh, I don't recognize that person. So good to have you, John, and welcome. I may just be not recognizing the last name, and you may sometimes post under other names or something. Or I could just be losing my mind, which is always a possibility. Between age, natural inclination, and pandemic, you know, senility is only a breath away at any time. Kelly, hello, good to see you. Becca, pleasure as always. Jerry already saw you, Jerry. Hey, Matthew. That Matthew here, who has just checked in and said hello, is our agent, my agent for 20 something, 30 years now. I don't know how long, long time. One of the world's great human beings and a talented writer and photographer in his own right, just besides his agenting work. So it's always a pleasure to see Matt, and he is a wonderful guy. Felina, hello, hi there, and Claudia, good evening. Alexis, yo. Is that two yos or is that one yo? I'll I'll have to let people figure it out from context. Jeremy. Hi, Jeremy. Hello, Pierre. Anna found her headphones. Hooray! Yes, less than 48 hours, says Matt. Yes, and I know what you're referring to. Those of you out there may also know what we're referring to here, but as I said, this is a no politics zone just while I'm reading, not because I am not political. I'm extremely political. Tash, hey, It's a gorgeous Arvo in Bendigo. Wonderful. Arvo is afternoon, I certainly assume. Alan David Clark. Hello, Alan. Nice to see you. Sally, nice to see you too. Very good evening. Tim. Hi, Tim. Hi, Carl. Steve. Hi, Steve. Band called Pandemic Senility, be a Carpenters cover band. I sort of am a Carpenters cover band all by myself because I can sing like well, no, actually Richard Carpenter could sing also. I was going to say I can sing like Richard and play the guitar like Karen, but they're probably both of them better at that than me anyway. Anyway, so Andrea, lovely to see you. I'm sorry you can't stay, but we will see you later. And Alexis, thank you for the clarification. Oh my God, I can't believe it. I just like walked in today and I was just sitting down and setting things up and I reached up and I flicked this lamp on and I went and the thing in it kind of didn't quite explode, but it definitely it was kind of like if I had the strength and energy and interest today, I would explode kind of a thing. So it was both entertaining and shocking. As most of my favorite things are. And not that losing a light just before doing the live broadcast is necessarily one of my favorite things, but I try not to I try not to take it too seriously. Other than that, anything to talk about particularly? No, we're hunkered down. We're working. The kids are working on things. Deb is working. Deb is doing a whole bunch of knitting, making sweaters, which if you're interested in seeing some of those, because she's actually selling them, you can check them out on her Facebook page or I believe they're also available, or their pictures are around on her Twitter feed as well. So you should go check that out if you have any interest in really nice fabric work. And what else? What else? Anything? I'm just working. I'm finishing up Brothers of the Wind, which is the short Ostenard novel. Trying to find time to work on other things as well, but I've got to get back. It's going to get thank you, Jeremy. I've got to get back to Navigator's Children as well, which still needs work. Anyway, so that's all we're really doing here is just working and hanging out and staying out of trouble. We are, like most people, we're kind of sick of being at home all the time, but like most sensible people, we are also trying to make sure that everybody stays healthy and everybody around us stays healthy. What a concept, right? What a wacky, wacky concept. Hey, let's not give a potentially fatal disease to somebody else. In fact, let's not even get it ourselves. Geez, I mean, that's like an amazing paradigm shift, leap of brilliance, right? Hey, let's not get a potentially deadly disease. Let's not spread it to other people. Result, profit. Anyway, so I am just hanging out and working and coming to visit you guys, or you guys coming to visit me, or we're all traveling together in the virtual realm, however you want to analyze it and think of it. And so I am going to read. So those of you who were not present with me last night, we had the whole segment where Theo and Cumber cannot find apple core in the smoking ruins of Daffodil House. However, while they were trying to get out, because Theo's pet nightmare, in the sense that it's following him everywhere he goes, first in Earth and now in Fairyland, Theo's pet nightmare has taken over the body of a cop now, a fairy cop, a constable, and is following them. So they escape the Daffodil complex through the underground and onto train tracks, where they meet on a train bridge, a big trestle railroad bridge. They meet the troll who owns the bridge, who is going to eat them, and then is going to actually let them off easy and just take a finger, 2 fingers. But just before doing this, the troll smells Theo's beloved leather jacket and winds up so enchanted by this smell of this unusual cow from the mortal world and the jacket it's made out of, that the troll lets them go. And so at the very end of the chapter, they had escaped from the underground, had stumbled up into a public park and fallen asleep there. So That's where things are. And of course, there's like martial law and all these, the equivalent thereof happening in Ferry because of the Thornapple Daffodil exciser wing of the party having just attacked their fellow fairy lords. So that's where we are. And so we're going to do chapter 27, Buttons Bridge. His first dream was a surreal horror, chewing and chewing on something that fought against him, something that actually struggled in his mouth. He was full of dark rejoicing, but also horrified by his own casual cruelty, simultaneously exalted and revolted. He passed on into other dreams that were more ordinary but no less dreadful, full of images of tiny bodies falling to dust in his clumsy hands, of a mulch of crisp black wings whispering beneath his feet like drifts of charred onion skin. He woke up, shivering beneath a sliver of moon. The world was cold and dark, and he hurt all over. He was alone on a hillside, tangled up in ivy. He was alone. Cumber! Theo's voice was a raw croak, and the effort made him cough until the stars that should have been in the sky, but weren't, frolicked right in front of his eyes. Shh! A shadow came toward him. Don't make so much noise! I thought you were gone. I've been looking for firewood. Well, and I've been out getting the news. Here, put this on. He tossed him a tattered, dirty thing that might have been a bedsheet. After a few puzzled moments of examination, Theo decided it was supposed to be a shirt. I found it in a rubbish bin, Cumber explained. Theo realized he was naked from the waist up. Of course, my jacket. He pulled the shirt over his head. It was so big on him that he wondered if it had belonged to an ogre. Getting the news? How? You don't think you and I are the only folks hiding out in this park, do you? In fact, there are a lot more folk here than usual. Not just the homeless ones, but all kinds of people who suddenly don't want to be in the buildings anymore, who want to be under trees and sky like in the old days. Everyone's terrified. Cumber sat and produced a small collection of twigs from his pockets. I thought I'd never want to see anything else burning, he said, but right now I need a fire. Theo sat in silence while the Ferrisher arranged the sticks, then took a piece of what looked like newspaper out of his pocket and rubbed it between his finger and thumb until the edges curled and began to burn. As he held it to the bits of bark he'd piled around the sticks, Theo asked, Was that the paper, or did you do that? Make the spark? Cumber shrugged. I did. Quite an easy charm, really. You could probably do it yourself with only a little practice, but I couldn't have done it yesterday. Too sore, too tired to think. How are your legs? Nothing broken, but they hurt, and the burn parts itch like a gnome's knickers. How are you? Miserable, scared, alive though, and that's something. He stared at the small flames beginning to climb the pile of kindling. What do we do now? Cumbersedge shook his head. He had managed to clean some of the worst of the dust and soot from his yellow-brown face and looked almost like the young lab attendant he had been when Theo had first met him. I don't know. It's chaos out there. What do you mean out there? Where are we? Raid Park, in the Gloaming District. One of the biggest parks in the city. Kind of a reminder of how things used to be before Hellebore and the others. Yes, good old Lord Daffodil, too. Tore down all of True Arden so the city could grow. He blinked. It's hard to believe Daffodil is really dead, the old tyrant. Actually, he wasn't all bad. And Lady Jonquil was always kind to me when she remembered I was there. I wonder if there's any chance. No. It sounded harsher than Theo meant it to be. He reached out and gave the Ferrisher an awkward pat on the arm. I'm sorry, but I don't think so. I saw what happened. Nobody got out of that meeting room alive. And Applecore? Cumbersedge seemed to be trying to keep hope out of his voice. Out of his heart, too. She might have got out, or not even been there when it went down. She left a message that she was going to go outside. A thought struck him. Oh, my sweet. Of course. Applecore left me a message. Said she saw someone I knew hanging around outside Daffodil House. I've been thinking she meant Tansy, but he said he didn't know anything about it. I have no idea what you're talking about. Theo explained his brief, brutal encounter with the treacherous Count Tansy. So he was the one who set me up in the first place. That seems pretty clear. But that doesn't matter. What I was saying was that I thought Applecore meant him. That Tansy was who she'd seen. But it wasn't. It was his relative, Rufinus, she'd spotted. Or anyway, it was his body walking around. And of course she found that a bit surprising because the last time we'd seen him, well, he'd been pretty much dead as a doornail. So she went off to find out why someone we thought was on the ex-citizens list was hanging around out in front of Daffodil House. He nodded. Makes sense. So you were saying she went to have a better look at that thing that tried to murder you? The thing that followed us? Yeah, exactly. He sobered as he realized what the Farisher was worrying about. They sat for a while in silence, staring at the flames. It was no good talking any more. They had little reason for hope and nothing more practical to rely on. So, what did you hear while you were out getting wood? Theo finally asked. It's war. The real thing. Cumber sighed and poked the fire. The mirror streams are full of it. Hellebore and Thornapple and their allies are claiming they only did it because they were going to be attacked, that it was self-defense. Nobody believes them, of course, but no one's in a position to argue with them either. They have parliamentary troops out all over the city looking for what they're calling conspirators, which basically means anyone they consider an enemy. Like you and me. Cumber smiled. Well, like you. I could probably still plead ignorance and be allowed to go back to the countryside. Find a job herding goats or something. His smile faded. Unless the mere fact of knowing you makes me an enemy too. I don't think you want to find out, Theo said. I think the questioning would be very bad for you. Cumber let out a long breath. Well, then, I guess I'm a fugitive too. So, is that it? It's all over? Hellebore burned down his enemies' houses, and now he's the winner? No, not quite that simple. For one thing, he's made a lot of the other houses rethink things, even if they're not going to say or do anything about it right now. After all, how could you trust someone who'd do that to 3 of his oldest allies? Hellebore and the other excisors are on top right now, so there's no question about that, but they're going to be like the old kings of the giants who murdered to get their thrones, then always had to sleep with one eye open, watching for the one who was coming to murder them in turn. Cumber spoke with grim satisfaction. And that's not all. The rumors, the least mad and unbelievable ones I've heard this evening anyway, say that a lot of people got out of the houses or weren't around when the attacks came, including Lady Jonquil's son, Cyrus. The rumor is that he's found refuge with another family, and even that he's planning to raise an army and fight back. A study of history suggests that the first reports are nearly always wrong, but it could be that Hellebore and the others haven't done as thorough a job as they'd hoped. Well, it's not as if that's going to do us any good, Theo said. We don't have any influential friends. Of course, Cyrus seemed to have a fond spot for you. Would he take us in? Maybe, if we could find him. But of course no one's going to admit just now that Lord Daffodil's nephew is their guest. Not with Hellebore and Thornapple running the Parliament of Blooms like it was their own corner nectar shop. So what do we do? Stay here? Maybe for a day, but we're too vulnerable out here in the woods. We don't know how long it will take that dead thing to track you down, and This park has also got a bit of a werewolf problem at night during the best of times. Say no more! Theo moved closer to the fire. The darkness of fairyland, he had come to realize, not only might harbor nearly anything you could imagine, it almost certainly did. So, what do they want? Hellebore and Thornapple and those people. We still don't know why they're interested in me, either. Why go to all that trouble to try and kidnap me out of Daffodil House? Power? That's usually the reason for everything. Cumber sighed. As to where you fit in, I can't even guess. I'm used to reading about these things in histories or hearing about them from survivors. I never wanted to be a survivor. Maybe not, but it beats the hell out of the alternatives. True. The Farisher held his slender hands up to the warmth. Well, whatever's going on, we can't stay, and we can't wander the streets either. Most people don't like the excisers, but they've got a firm grip on the city right now, and there will be lots of folk interested in getting on their good side by turning in a couple of wanted fugitives. Theo was thinking about werewolves now. He had already been thinking about walking corpses and wished he could have left it at just that, ghastly as it was. God, it's cold. I can't believe you made me give away my jacket, Sedge. At least having fewer fingers wouldn't have made me any colder. Well, that's gratitude for you. Cumber squinted at the lump in Theo's pants pocket. What is that, if you don't mind my asking? I saw you take it out of the jacket. You already know what it is. My great-uncle's diary, notebook, whatever. I told you about it. I thought it was the reason that Hellebore's people wanted me, but now I know that's not true. You saved it? Cumber brightened. He looked like a young boy holding his first 4th of July sparkler. That's wonderful news. Is there, do you think, would it be too much for me to ask to look at it? Go ahead, knock yourself out. As Theo handed it to him, something small fell out and into his lap, a curl of white not much bigger than a receipt. The Farisher stared at the book cradled in his lap with a sort of happy greed. An actual record of a mortal's impressions of fairy in the recent past. Mortal studies is my specialty, you know. I've waited my whole life for something like this. Theo lifted the piece of paper that had fluttered out of the book. He squinted, struggling to read it by the fire's flickering light. Beneath the old Fayfort Bridge. What the hell is this? Then it came back to him, the little bright-eyed creature on the bus. Oh, right, a goblin gave it to me. I think it's some kind of mission or homeless shelter. Told me if I ever needed a place to stay. He turned to Cumber. Hey! The Farisher seemed more alarmed than pleased. Who gave it to you? A goblin? Let me see that. He stared at the slip of paper as though he hoped to turn it into something else by force of will. Fayfort Bridge. That's down by the Fenland, past Warstones even, all the way on the other side of the city. And it's a terrible place. Dangerous, full of poor people, criminals. Are there werewolves? Werewolves. Cumber pursed his lips. No, of course not. It's down in the wetlands near the city docks. Well, that's enough to recommend it to me. No where-whatevers. But goblins? You know, you fairies have some real problems with prejudice. Theo even smiled, pleased to have some direction again. A destination. No goblin's ever done anything bad to me. Why are you all so set against them? I can't speak for anyone else, Cumber said primly, but a group of them ate my great-grandmother. Surely that's reason for a bit of prejudice. Theo woke to dawn, and skies that were still black with smoke, fouled like a mountain pool trampled to muddiness. Cumber Sedge was building another small fire. About time you woke up, considering you slept the day away yesterday, he said. I've already been up and visiting some of our fellow nature lovers. He held up something that looked like a coffee can, with the words Wing Clear on it in big white letters. I brought back some water from the stream. He produced a wrinkled bag from his pocket. Oh, and got us some bread, too. Here, break your fast. Theo hadn't realized how hungry he was until he put the heel of crusty bread into his mouth. He barely chewed before swallowing it down, then took his time with the second piece. How did you get this? You said you didn't have any money. He looked at Cumber more carefully. Hey, where are your shoes? Well, I don't really need them. In fact, a lot of people in Daffodil House thought it was pretty funny I even wore them. Among the flower folk, there's an old expression for taming things up in a vulgar way. You might as well put shoes on a Farisher. Eat up. It's better than walking across the city on an empty stomach. When Theo had emptied his bladder and they had put out the fire, fastidious Cumber insisted these be two separate activities, which Theo thought was a waste of water. He discovered that he actually could walk fairly well if he ignored the fact that he felt as though he had been run through some kind of industrial laundry folding machine. If I hurt this much, your leg must be killing you, he said to Cumber, wincing as he tried to get circulation into various suffering muscles. I'm not doing too badly. We Farishers heal quickly, and we work hard without much complaint. That's why the nobility regard it as such a waste when one of us wants to use his mind instead. Come, let's get going. Luckily, we can go some miles through the park without having to go near a public street. Cumber seemed to have shed some of his civilized pessimism along with his footwear. He seemed almost cheerful as they set off through the trees. The ground was still wet, steaming with mist. It was hard to tell where the hilltops left off and gray sky began. Explain to me again how your grandma got eaten by goblins. I kept nodding off. Cumber sighed. I wish you'd quit going on about that. It's not a particularly pleasant story. I told you she was mostly unlucky, and it was my great-grandmother. She and her husband were, what would you call them? They wanted their own land, so they made a farm in a very wild area. Homesteaders, that's what we call them back home. Pioneers. I suppose. Anyway, it wasn't all the goblins' fault. They were wild, and it was their land, I suppose. This was just before the last Goblin War. The local clan got into a dispute with my great-grandfather, and he shot a few of them. With a gun? One of those beehive things? This was centuries and centuries ago, Theo. They didn't have modern weapons. It was an old-fashioned crossbow. Anyway, the goblins came back and attacked them. My great-grandfather got away, but my great-grandmother was killed. So they ate her. Yeesh! Theo made a face. I can see why you don't approve of them, I guess. Well, to be fair, they ate their own as well, if they were killed in a battle. Sort of an honor, I suppose. Perhaps they're even trying to show respect for old great-grandmother by their lights. But my great-grandfather didn't take it that way. Wow. That's like one of those old West movies or something. So why are there all these goblins in the city now? Do they still eat people? Only as a mark of high honor, I'm told, and only their own kind. Cumber led Theo over a ridgetop where they had a fleeting glimpse of some of the city's highest towers, gold and rose in the smoky morning light, before they made their way down into cover again. The highest towers that are still standing, Theo thought. His light-hearted mood evaporated. See, after the last Goblin War, Cumber resumed, when we had well and truly defeated them, and the city began expanding out onto what had been goblin lands, there was a lot of argument about what to do with the goblin tribes. Some of the flower families just wanted to do away with them, kill them all, but some of them, more far-sighted, suggested that there would be a growing need for cheap labor. So the goblins were put to work. A lot were brought into the city itself in the last couple of centuries as the expansion began in earnest. He made an awkward gesture. Now that things have slowed down, what with energy shortages and all, there's not enough work for all of them, but they don't really have anywhere to go back to. It's a problem. But there are some still living wild, right? I saw some from the train in Great Rowan. Grimm's? Cumber looked surprised. You saw Grimm's in Great Rowan? Are you sure? Yeah. Applecore saw him too. He pushed on past the moment's sad silence. They looked like, I don't know, Genghis Khan's Mongols or something. Wild, fierce. I don't know what Genghis Khan's Mongols are, but I've seen the Grimms too, out in Ash, where most of those who didn't come into the city and into the town still live. For a moment his eyes lost focus, and he slowed his brisk pace. Stirring, in a way. So your family were settlers then? Country folk? Cumber laughed a touch bitterly. Oh, yes, still are. Rustic as dirt. But you're like a college graduate or something. This time, he didn't even laugh. You saw my back, Theo. Do you think the trade was worth it? Good God, is that really the entrance requirement for fairy universities? Losing your wings? And the kids back home think they've got it tough. It's not that straightforward, of course. Cumber shook his head, watching his own bare feet crunch through the undergrowth. This shoeless stuff didn't seem to bother him at all. My mother came to the city from the Jonquils country place. She was a favorite of Lady Amelia's, kind of a pet. When she had me, well, of course, she raised me here around a mistress's children, and Lady Amelia indulged her. But I wasn't the same as the flower children, and one of the most obvious ways to tell was that I had wings. They haven't had wings in the Daffodil clan for several generations now, not even rudimentary throwbacks. So Mum saved up her money. She wouldn't even let Lady Amelia help out. There's pride for you. Won't even take charity to help mutilate your son. And I had the operation. But you know something, Theo? Even the ones who didn't see my back, even the first day I was at the academy with Zyrus and the rest, the other students knew. I was a Farisher, wasn't I? And Farishers are supposed to have little wings. They thought it was funny. Well, the nice ones did. Some of the others thought I was getting above my place and let me know it regularly and forcefully. Theo couldn't think of much to say. Except for occasional run-ins with the jock crowd, his cheerfully stoned high school days back at Hillsdale High didn't really compare. It's just the way things are. Cumber said. Not much use complaining. They'll be worse now, with Hellebore and his lot in charge. So I guess even before this, some folks weren't too happy with the way things are around here. Theo had barely even considered Fairyland before winding up as an unwilling guest, let alone the real possibility of Fairyland class warfare. Oh, yeah, all too true. But it hasn't always been like this. In the old days, things were a lot simpler. Everyone had his or her patch, and everything just sort of went on. Boring, maybe, but you didn't see gnome children begging on street corners. Things began to go bad when the king and queen died. That was really the start of the whole thing. The 7 most powerful families, 6 now, got into power and began changing things right away. The sudden realization was painful to see. 3 families now, and probably long before, 3 families now, and probably before long it'll be down to 1, the Hellebore Empire. Theo supposed that some things weren't that different from his own world. The people in power were always trying to get more of it. It wasn't enough to be eating the best meat, while the rest of the population chewed old bones. The big dogs all seemed to have the same secret goal, each one dreaming of the day when he alone would be the one biggest dog, eating sweet bloody flesh until he was full to vomiting, while others starved. Did it hurt? Having your wings off? Hurt? No, of course not. This is the modern age. They can cut away your entire life and you'll never feel a thing. It took them most of the morning to make their way across Raid Park. The intervening day had made his emotional wounds a little less raw, and Theo was at last able to talk about Applecore, although neither he nor the Farisher could bear to speculate over what might have happened to her. Theo found himself telling Cumber at great length about her bravery and the deep well of kindness guarded by her exceedingly sharp tongue, and was surprised to discover how much Cumber already knew about her. The Farisher and the Sprite seemed to have had a few long talks during the time in Daffodil House. The conversation began to feel like a wake. Cumber seemed at least as miserable as Theo about the fact that they had lost her, and that it was probably forever. At last, in frustration and sorrow, they fell into silence. They stopped to rest about an hour past noon, and Cumber produced the rest of the bread he had acquired that morning. Theo was astonishingly hungry and happy to have it, but he was beginning to want more. Real food, a real bed, safety. But you're not going to get it, are you? Not any time in the foreseeable future, so live with what you've got. Complaining was more than useless. It was a display of foolish ingratitude. He had survived what should have been certain death several times with nothing worse than a bruised, aching body and miserably crusty lungs. He had a companion, a friend, perhaps, who was risking his own life to help him. Theo was fairly certain that even though the city might not be a safe place for Cumber Sedge right now, there were spots in the countryside where even a wingless Farisher could find shelter and aid. Yet here Cumber was, patiently answering questions so basic that he must have felt like a kindergarten teacher at the end of a long, long field trip. Speaking of questions, Theo was still having trouble getting the hang of the local chronology. So, you said the seven families took over, what, a few centuries ago? Cumber gave him an amused look. Are you planning on taking a test? I don't think it will be your uncertain grasp of history that will be the biggest strike against you for citizenship at the moment. No, I'm just trying to figure things out. Mostly where I fit into all this. Hellebore and his cronies want me, so the reason I'm here has something to do with him. But he certainly didn't need anything I could give him, or tell him, to launch his little flower war. Theo frowned, struggling to think, and to keep up with Cumber at the same time. The barefooted and apparently revitalized Farisher was proving an exhausting hiking companion. I know I keep saying this, but I'm not anybody. I'm just an out-of-work musician. It doesn't make sense. No, it doesn't. Right. Well, there must be something I don't know yet. So help me out. I'm supposed to be a fairy. Okay. My only other connection with this place is that someone I thought was my great-uncle was here about 30 or 40 years ago. Well, that's in my world time. How much is that here? How long ago? Cumber shook his head. It's not that simple, I'm afraid. The time flows differently in our world than your world, and often it seems to flow faster here, but not always. You're combining two unstable systems, and there are geographical effects to factor in as well, which won't make much sense to you. I've studied your world enough to know that places that are proximate in your world stay proximate. Theo considered that for a moment. Yeah, he admitted. Generally, if a train goes from San Francisco to L.A., you don't wake up one day and find out suddenly that it stops at New York between the two. Cumber smiled. What amazing names! I never get over them. The pictures they make in my head. San Francisco. Like a name from a dream. Yeah, you should see the fair folk dancing down in the Castro on Halloween, Theo snorted. It's something out of an old folk tale, all right. Time to be walking again. We're moving along the edge of the Twilight District now, but we still have a very long way to go, and I'd like to get there before nightfall. Their path began a long descent. The hills were more and more sparsely covered with trees, and now Theo could see just glimpses of a great expanse of silvery water to their right. Yes, said Cumber. The islands of High Brazil are just out of sight beyond the horizon to the east there. I've often thought I'd like to go there, get away from this terrible city. So is it an ocean or a lake? It's just the water, Cumber said and shrugged. If you go out far enough, it's the ocean, but here it's a lake. Well, kind of a bay in places. I don't think I can explain. Theo could also see vast stretches of urban housing and industrial blocks between the park and the water, but the district below them had little in the way of the high towers that dotted the city center. Is that where we're going? No, that's Eastwater. We'll go through one end of it on our way. Mostly warehouses and very cheap flats for very poor people. Farther north, see out there where there aren't so many buildings? That's the edge of the fenland. It's a sort of swamp between the city proper and the dockyards. The Moonflood River lets out there, and the old Fayfort Bridge is one of the last bridges across the river. Hardly ever used now, I think, because the railroad and the main highway bypass it and come in through Eastwater. I still can't get used to hearing the word railroad used to describe something in fairyland, let alone power plants. When did all this happen? When the city expanded after the 7 families took over. Lord Hellebore may hate mortals, although I can't think of any reason he should particularly. They say he used to visit the mortal world regularly before the Clover effect was in place. But he and his kind certainly love all the things that mortals have come up with. It's one of the reasons we have so many power problems. The flower families have built so much, so fast. It used to be that the power for all the charms and cantrips and spells of fairy could be provided by the king and queen. Well, by what the king and queen did. What exactly did they do? I don't know, really. Provided the power, or perhaps channeled it. They simply were, and somehow that was enough. But with them gone and the city growing so fast, the 7 families and the Parliament had to find other ways to provide power to make everything work. So they developed the plants. For a moment, Theo was confused, imagining some utopian scheme of deriving energy from soybeans. What kind of plants? Power plants, of course, where they make the scientific energy that runs the lights and the coaches and the trains and everything. And so Parliament passed the power generation laws and they began the conscription. Hang on, you've lost me again. Conscription, that's like a draft, right? Like when they pick you to go into the army, whether you want to or not? Is that what it means in your world? Cumber nodded. I knew you used the term, but since your science is so different, we don't even think of it as science, to be honest. I couldn't imagine what it meant, and it's so hard to find reliable texts even in the university libraries. I'm still confused. Why do people get conscripted here? Not to go in the army, I take it. Cumber shook his head. No. You really didn't know? Sorry, but it's the kind of thing every schoolboy learns, even if he's only going to spend his life grazing sheep. The conscription determines who goes to the power plants. That doesn't seem so bad. It's a job, anyway. Why do they have to force people? Cumber said, stopped. Theo, when I say that people are conscripted to go to the power plants, I don't mean to go work there, supervise, take care of the machinery, do the bookkeeping. They have ordinary employees who make decent wages who do that. People who go home to their families every night and live in houses or flats. No, the people who are conscripted are the ones who generate the power. Or rather, after they lose the lottery, they're taken off to the plants and the power is drained out of them. A few years, 10 at the most. And then they're retired. But there's not much left after the plants are done with them, no matter what the government propaganda claims. I did my bit, and now I've a long golden retirement in front of me, thanks to Thornapple Generation, LPB, or whatever they call it. I've seen a few of the real survivors. People from my own village before the operators wised up and started shutting them away in power worker retirement hostels so that potential replacements didn't have to walk past them every day on the village high street and see them shuffling and drooling. You mean these power plants somehow suck the power out of people? Out of live, very people? Where else would it come from? Cumber's sour laugh returned. And why do you think my mother was so anxious for me to go to school and get my name taken out of the lottery? Modern power generation is the wonder of science, Theo. So few giving so much for so many. That old darling, Lord Daffodil, who was just burned to crackling yesterday, invented that phrase. He used to get a tear of pride in his eye when someone quoted it back to him. He used to talk a lot about the good old days when the farm boys would come spilling off the wagons, anxious to take their place in the generators and do their bit for the good of Fairy. Theo had to walk without speaking for a while. Bile was swimming in his throat, and he was afraid if he opened his mouth, he might throw up. By the time they left the park and the trees behind them for good, and descended by a series of winding cobblestoned roads back into the city, an industrial area full of boxy warehouses and equally boxy flat blocks, with washing rippling on the line on every balcony like flags of surrender, it was mid-afternoon, and Theo was losing the surprising energy that had kept him going through the morning. The pall of smoky gray clouds overhead mirrored his mood. As he stared at the long block stretching before him, the buildings featureless except for the surreal silver rooftop sculptures called mirror masts, which Cumber's confusing explanation seemed to suggest were a bit like television antennas, and the occasional flowering of graffiti on a wall, the symbols even more cryptic and abstract than what he was used to back home, he found himself thinking of Anna, a girl he had dated for a while in the mid-'80s. She had been a self-proclaimed Wiccan, although her version seemed largely self-invented, as far as Theo could tell. She never cursed or thanked in the name of God, but always the goddess, and had a deep and reverent love for dragons, unicorns, and fairies. Theo had thought she was a bit dippy, in fact, but their off-and-on relationship, built mostly around long days spent under her handmade quilt in her tiny apartment, had lasted for the better part of a year, and had been a bit of refuge for him during a fallow period of his life. He had not thought about Anna in a long time, but now he found himself remembering her solemn explanations of what the fairy folk got up to with both cynical amusement and a kind of regret. It's just as well old Anna never made it here, he thought, watching a tiny housewife out on her balcony, pulling so many different children's outfits off the line that he was almost certain she was only renting until she had the deposit together for a shoe. I mean, this is the actual place she used to talk about so much. Where all the magic comes from, she used to say. They live off our dreams. And you know what? She was right, but not in a very nice way. He remembered what the now very dead Lord Hollyhock had said about Helibor's plan, about something called the Terrible Child. And it's going to be even less pleasant soon, he thought. They're going to be living off our dreams the way leeches live off blood, except leeches don't have to destroy their victims' whole society. You look dreadful, fella, said Cumber. Don't worry, we'll be out of the city and into the fenlands soon. It's not that, not really. I was just thinking about how people, my people, or at least the kind of people I thought I was. He paused, having confused himself a bit. About how so many human stories are about fairyland, poetry, songs, and whether they think the place is wonderful or scary, they always imagine this place as beautiful, magical, terrible, but glamorous. And there is some of that, but a lot of it's like this. Cumber nodded slowly. If you find that depressing, imagine how someone like me feels about it. This is where I live. Gently but effectively silenced, Theo kept walking. They ate the last of the bread as they passed through a district even less prepossessing than the one they had just traversed. A sprawling shanty town that looked like it was constructed of white plywood. It was a bad neighborhood by any standards, but the locals, who came to watch them from the doors of their hovels or peered down at them from low rooftops, a rabble of dirty and distracted full-sized fairies, along with brownies, gnomes, and squint-eyed pukas, seemed far too beaten down to pose much of a threat. Still, as they walked through the narrow twisting alleys, Theo kept an eye out for fairyland muggers. They were just about to cross the local equivalent of a main road, where the shanties stood some half-dozen paces apart, and tire treads rutted the muddy street, when Cumber suddenly grabbed Theo and pushed him back into the shadow of a doorway. They watched as a strange open car rolled past, more like a jeep than anything else, but with differences in shape and line that would have irritated or even panicked most mortal designers. Half a dozen constables in heavy cloaks and helmets were perched on it, all armed with beehive guns, their outfits decorated with the abstract flower glyph that Cumber had told him was the parliamentary insignia. A rabble of children from what looked like a dozen species followed in their wake, little goblins among them, begging for food and money. The grim-faced fairies on the jeep paid no attention, but Theo was grateful for the noise and distraction of the children. The vehicle did not even slow as it drove past their hiding spot. "How far do those guns shoot?" he asked in a whisper when the constables were well past them. "As far as they need to," said Cumber. "Well, the hornets get tired after flying a while, especially if they've been in the clip for too long without being fed." Theo shook his head. "You mean there are real live bugs in there?" Cumber nodded. "Sort of. They're made out of metal. It's a scientific thing." "Metal, but they still eat? What do they get fed?" "Bronze shavings, mostly." Theo sighed. He sometimes thought he could live here for years and still not understand a thing. Excuse me. Soon after the brush with the constables, they left the last of the Eastwater shanty town behind them. The whole of East now seemed to be spread before them, but it was strangely uninspiring. The land between them and the water was a descending set of rolling hills, studded with rock outcroppings, patchily covered with low trees bent into bizarre shapes by the constant wind, a wind that was already making Theo's clothes snap and flutter. "It's pretty gloomy out here. Didn't used to be. Do you see that silvery line there? That's the Moonflood River. It used to be the lifeblood of the place. Went right past the great hill where the first fairies lived. But when they began building the city up, they dammed it and rerouted it, and cut channels so it could be used to irrigate the lands west of the city, until it wasn't much more than a trickle." He swept his hand across the flat, dismal prospect. "This was all true Arden, covered with trees. The Queen used to have her dances in the forest meadows past Warstones below what's now Battle Hill. You can see the hill if you squint over there. Yes, that ugly piece of rock. But they blocked the river and cut down the forest, and this all became mud flats, rocky hills. Well, you can see for yourself." The view wasn't particularly inspiring, but the walking was a little easier across the sparsely forested hills, and Theo was grateful for that. Still, he couldn't help contrasting the emptiness with the almost hallucinatory beauty of the woods on Larkspur's land, and said so. "Oh, that," Cumber shrugged. "That's not a real forest. That's a rich man's preserve. It used to be part of the Silverwood. In fact, all of Larkspur's lands used to be a tiny section of the Silverwood." "It's the same old story, Theo. You must be tired of hearing it by now. I'm certainly tired of telling it. It's gone. They just saved a little piece for Larkspur and his friends to hunt in." "You people really do like to imitate my world." Cumber only smiled sadly. An hour later they had reached the Moonflood, more a sluggish canal than a river, hemmed by stone embankments on either side, which were the highest features for miles, other than a few lumpish hills. The sun had fallen low in the west, the beginnings of a spectacular red glow illuminating the smoky skies. The temperature was dropping, and mist was rising from the flat, muddy lands around the river. Theo shivered. It had been bad enough sleeping out of doors in the park with its sheltering ivy and trees. The idea of spending a night exposed in this glum rack, listening to the distant shriek of seabirds, was miserable indeed. Even Cumber seemed doubtful. "There it is, the old Fayfort Bridge." He pointed to what looked like nothing more than a pile of wreckage, visible now as they crested a long, shallow slope. It squatted over the river like a discarded parade float, a fantasy castle that had been sat on by a giant. Good God, Theo thought. Round here, that could have really happened. The bridge towers had mostly collapsed. Great round shards of wall lay half submerged in the moving water, causing the only curls of white Theo had seen the whole sluggish length of the river. A few sections still stood atop the bridge, but only one tower had kept most of its stones. It stood at one end of the wide span like a single tooth in the mouth of a cartoon witch. On either side, where the bridge met the muddy riverbanks, lay more tumbles of fallen stone, half vanished into the muck, and looking so much like the turds of some immense animal that Theo found himself wishing he had never thought about giants at all. "This bridge used to guard the river when that was the city's most vulnerable and important artery," Cumber said, "when the river mattered." "I don't see anyone around." "Maybe they've been chased away." Cumber didn't sound anywhere near as sad about it as Theo was. No, wait, there's someone moving up on top of it." Theo shielded his eyes. "Not very many of them. I think they see us too." Whether they did or didn't, a moment later the distant figures had vanished from the bridge's crumbling fortifications, and the landscape seemed entirely lifeless again. It took them another quarter of an hour to follow the river's course down to the foot of the bridge. The space under it was choked with refuse, pieces of wood, piles of stone. Theo could barely see water and was amazed that the river could find places to flow through it toward the east. Up close, he was even more surprised by how big the structure was, hundreds of feet from one bank to the other. Its single remaining tower was almost half the height of Daffodil House. He was still staring up in amazement, wondering how many carefully chiseled stone blocks had gone into such an immense thing, when someone shouted at them to stop. "Do not move!" They could barely hear the invisible sentry over the wind sawing through the bridge's broken stones. "There are guns looking upon you!" Theo and Cumber kept very still as a wiry little shape clambered down from one of the broken towers near them. It was a goblin, dressed only in a loincloth and vest, despite the wind. At first, Theo thought it might be the one who had given him the slip of paper, but after a moment he saw that this one was smaller and older, with grizzled white whiskers surrounding his wide mouth. Still, his movements were sure. He leaped down from stone to stone until he reached the lower fortifications, then clambered down at the outer wall on a rope that Theo had not even noticed, and came toward them. "What do you seek?" The goblin looked more put out than nervous, despite the fact that even Cumber was almost a head taller than he was. Maybe there really are guns pointed at us, Theo thought. It was a depressing idea. He felt too tired to outrun a banana slug, let alone magical metallic bees. He started to reach into his pocket, then remembered all the television shows he'd seen about police standoffs and hostage situations. "I have a piece of power. I have a piece of paper," he said slowly and clearly. "A goblin gave it to me, invited me to come here. I'm going to take it out of my pocket now." The white-whiskered goblin looked distinctly unimpressed. "Produce this paper then, or a mighty stinging is what you will receive." "Friendly folk around here," Theo said under his breath. He reached into his floppy fairy shirt and experienced a moment of real panic before he finally found the paper crammed down into the bottom of the pocket. The goblin squinted at it, then held it up to the western sky as if looking for a watermark. His eyes grew round and his finger-length nose quivered. He looked at Theo and Cumber with something like astonishment, and for a few bad seconds, Theo thought they were both going to be shot. "Follow me, kind fellows," the goblin said. He actually bowed before turning around to lead them to the foot of the bridge. "By the trees, look at this!" Cumber had stopped to lean over the side of the bridge. Theo, who had been surreptitiously scouting around for the hidden marksman with whom they had been threatened, checked with their goblin guide to see if it was all right to look. The goblin didn't seem to care, so he went to stand by the Farisher. The shanties had been invisible from the direction Theo and Cumber had come, but they were packed up against the other side of the dilapidated bridge along both banks, as though a great flood had left them behind. The little town extended far down the riverside toward Is. Theo thought he could see the end of the shanties about a mile away, but it was hard to tell through the growing shadows. The camp was full of many kinds of fairy folk, although the slender brown and gray goblins seemed to be in the majority. "There must be hundreds of people here," Theo murmured. "No, thousands." "And another 1,000 or so. And another 1,000 or so right under your feet, are living in the fortifications of the bridge and beneath the pilings, and even on rafts in the river underneath." The whiskered goblin sounded quite pleased with these arrangements. "But you, young masters, probably have heard these truths already, if intimates you be of our great Button." "Button?" Theo shook his head. "Who's Button?" "Ah, yes." The goblin shook his head approvingly and laid a finger beside his long, long nose. "The more quiet now, the less shouting later." Theo could only wonder what that was supposed to mean, or what weird misunderstanding he had started with his slip of paper. He noted with some surprise that instead of taking them down toward the shanty town along the river banks, their goblin guide was leading them over the length of the bridge toward the one remaining tower. As they neared it, two large creatures stepped out of the shadowed doorway. They were ogres, Theo was surprised to see, and at least as large and ugly as Tansy's bodyguards, Teddy and Dolly. They glared suspiciously at Theo and Cumber, but at a cheerful gesture from the old goblin they stepped back, their misshapen gray faces suddenly more respectful. And yes, I know we're just past 8. I'm going to read a little bit longer, just a couple minutes at the most. The two new arrivals were led up a narrow flight of stone stairs into the tower. Theo was already exhausted, and after they had climbed what he guessed was about 5 floors worth, he was hoping that if for some reason this was all an elaborate trick to capture them, the capture would quickly be followed by an execution just to stop his legs from aching. Instead, they reached a heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs. The goblin pushed it open and stepped aside, waving for them to walk through. "He speaks to some Perry dancers who come all the way from Gateway Oak," their guide whispered as they went past. "So it is possible that you may have need to wait a while before you can be in audience with him." At the far end of the room sat another slightly larger goblin, wearing a brown robe so basic that it might have been something a Franciscan monk would put on while his good clothes were being cleaned. Behind him sat a half circle of goblins and other fairyland creatures, perhaps a dozen in all, of which only one was the kind that looked mostly human, a handsome golden-haired man in the ageless middle years of his sort. He and the others looked up as Theo and Cumber came cautiously forward, but the goblin did not take his eyes off the trio of almost impossibly slender beings who sat before him, dressed in diaphanous silks and looking more like dream creatures than things of flesh and blood. The goblin at last held his hand up and spread his fingers, bowed his head briefly toward the fey trio, and then, for the first time, looked to the newcomers. Theo recognized him as the one who had given him the paper in the bus station. A smile gently curved across the goblin's thin face. "You have come. I hoped that it would be so. I am honored by your trust." He shut his eyes for a moment as if dropping off to sleep. "Sad. I am sad, but at the moment I have these other honored guests who have need of my poor thoughts and meager assistance." He made a graceful gesture toward the sylph-like creatures that Theo guessed must be the Perry dancers the other goblin had mentioned. Do you need me longer, Button? The white-whiskered goblin asked. Door latch. Thanks to you. Go if you wish. Oh, but would you be so kind as to bring my friend Nettle up to see me before you return to your post? The old goblin called door latch gave an oddly casual wave and headed back down the stairs. Now, the one called Button said to Theo and Cumber, until I can give you of my time and offer you to drink as is proper, I think perhaps you will have the most comfort with one of your own kind. He turned to the yellow-haired fairy. Caradinus, perhaps you could see that these guests are well hosted? Certainly. The fairy rose. He was quite tall and wore a kind of loose, unconstructed suit that looked like it belonged on the veranda of a sugarcane plantation. Come with me, he told Theo and Cumber. Very many thanks to you for your patience. Very many thanks to you for your patience, called Button as they were led back to the stairs, Theo groaning inwardly at the thought of having to go all that way back down. Soon we will speak together. And that's where we're going to stop. Oi! So, put my glasses back on in case I have to read something. Anyway, love to share with you, and it was great fun as always. Sorry if I kept you a little late, but I was trying to come to a fairly decent place to stop, and there really wasn't one there, so we just stopped. But I found the best I could. So anyway, well, next week I will be continuing. We are moving on through. We're past the halfway point, and next Sunday at 2 a.m. and then again at 7 p.m. I will be reading. Until then, thank you so much for joining me. It's lovely to see you all, friends, family, everybody. We appreciate you, and I appreciate you. And I will say, just keep taking care of yourselves and other people, and we will all make it through somehow. I'm pretty darn sure of that. Anyway, so once again, thank you. Good night. Be well, and I will